let's talk about Tzelem Elokim. So, Tzelem Elokim usually translates as the image of God. This is a concept which has also made it pretty big. It's pretty popular. I think if you use the phrase image of God in some kind of normal conversation, it usually is not viewed as a phrasing that is just completely unfamiliar, even to someone who's not, really thinking about philosophy or religious constructs in any form. It's pretty much a relatively well-known concept, and there's probably a few reasons why that is. But the question is, can we understand sort of like what exactly this thing is? And I just want to sort of show that there's a lot going on behind the scenes, and the sort of like cultural or regular way of talking about it, which is just the image of God. First of all, that's obviously pretty vague, right? Like, what exactly does the image of God even mean? I mean, if we don't have any clear understanding of what God is when we say the word God, so unless you have a very clearly defined understanding of what you mean when you say that, so something which is in the image of God, it's unclear what you're even saying. An image of something which is made in the image of something else, so it sounds like it means it's almost like replicating it in some way. And then, of course, you'd have to be explaining or describing in what way people or man is actually a replica or made in the image of whatever it is that you think God is. So these are automatic vagaries that are inside of the discussion here. Also, if you look at the original word, the word Tzelem Elokim, the phrase Tzelem Elokim, shows up, by the way, in Parshas Bereshis, in Genesis, the very beginning of the Torah. So that word, that pairing of words, Tzelem Elokim, so first of all, the word Tzelem sounds like it could mean image in some form. It seems to have something to do with structural, a structure. So if something is made in the Tzelem of something, it seems to be that would fit. It's sort of like structurally parallel in some way. Elokim, though, is a funny word, and so if you're made in Tzelem Elokim, well, you'll notice that in the actual Torah, so there's a lot of different names for Hashem, what we call Hashem meaning the name, so for what we call, the source of reality, so the conscious self that is manifest as all being that you encounter around you. So you see there's a lot of different names for that, the principal name being the name that's spelled with 4 letters that are Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. That's what we mean when we say the name Hashem. We're referring to the name, that particular name. So it's a little funny, since that's like the principal name of Hashem, the Yud K Vav K name. So it's a little funny that if that's the main name, so then why do we talk about Tzelem Elokim as opposed to like Tzelem Yud K Vav K, Tzelem Hashem? Why don't we say that? So those are just some questions to sort of, I guess, lay the groundwork for how to think about the problem here. And so I want to just add another detail here, which is that there's this ongoing issue, I think, in the Jewish education space, the Jewish learning space, the Torah learning space, which I mentioned in a couple of other segments that I've done here, which is that there are just certain books, and not just, I shouldn't even say certain, there's, certain books that kind of are more read than other books. And if there's, hundreds or thousands of different volumes that have been compiled by, our incredibly wise authors over the last couple of thousand years, it's not like today. Today, there's literally hundreds of Jewish books being put out every year, and people are constantly writing new books. But it's a little bit different than in the past. It's sort of like mimicking the regular book scene in the non-Jewish world, which is that there's a lot of books being put out. The amount of literacy is very high. People are really it's unprecedented, but 99% of America is literate, and also a lot of other Western countries. So that's a new phenomenon just by itself. But you have all these different ways of putting out books now, so it's very easy to do. And you have all these books that, some of them are super valuable and very full of profoundly important ideas, and some of them are just kind of recycling old ideas or just, pretty much adding nothing. And you have that exact phenomenon and trend also in the Torah world, where there's a lot of recycling of ideas and just sort of people putting out books on Parsha or just kind of some random books. And not to knock that, it's good for the authors. That's obviously a respectable activity. But to understand that there are different qualities of books, and some books are better than others because the ideas in them are more significant or central or profound. It's important to recognize that. So it's also when you go back over the thousands of years of our writing, so there's a lot of books that we put together, not like today. And we're talking about people who had to struggle to compile ideas and write them down. And for some reason, we only read or teach or learn 10 to 20% of those books. So that's an interesting thing to think about. But the upshot of that is that there's a whole array of information just about the concept of Tzelem Elokim, just like there is about pretty much every other aspect of the Torah, that I think really adds a tremendous amount of context, constructs, and information about Tzelem Elokim. And so what's ironic is when we have conversations about this topic and we have never read those things, then we're simply lacking a lot of information. So I want to sort of put down some of that information into this segment, give you an idea of sort of what this is talking about, and then you can go look these things up yourself. You're welcome to go read a great book to read. Nefesh HaChaim is an easy one to read. But really, you can check out any commentary on the concept of Tzelem Elokim from the Rishonim or from the Medrash from 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. And you can also find actual books that are written principally about this concept largely. And anytime you'll find it referenced, the overview I'm going to give now pretty much encompasses the totality of the concept, and then anything else that you read. So I would encourage you to think about, when you read something about it, think about it, and you'll find very quickly that you'll see that what you're reading is sort of like a subcategory or one facet of the overview meta framework that I'm going to just present now. So Tzelem Elokim is meant to deal with exactly the same process and issue that Elokim is dealing with. And so what that really is that we experience the world around us, in terms of its finite diversity. There's all this diverse existence, so many different things that are manifest here, that are being all around us, and they're very different, and they, even in their building blocks, they're pretty different, going down to the atomic level, the molecular level, structural level, the macro level. Everything is very, very different and very diverse. And so that diversity, the way the Torah describes it describes it with the word Elokim. You'll notice the word Elokim itself is conjugated in plural, and it's a pluralization of the word El, and the word El means force, or essentially like a vector, which is why the word El also means to, like I'm going to a certain place, ani holech el hamakom hazeh, I'm going to that place. So El essentially is like it's a directional vector, which is that I'm trying to move towards something, and that movement essentially is what we mean when we say force. There are directional forces that are pushing within the space that we live in, that are going in different directions, and so the word El means force. And the word Elokim, or really the word Elohim, because really, unless you're referring to Hashem when you say that word, so the word is pronounced Elohim, and the word actually means a plurality of forces, a conglomeration of forces that are all essentially stemming from some core place, and they are all operating in different directions in different ways. But that's what the word Elohim means, a conglomeration of forces. In the Gemara and in some of the later literature, like the Rishonim and some of the poskim, so the word Elokim, referring to Hashem, is explained as Baal HaKochos Kulam, which means sort of like the center master of all forces. Hashem is the total master of all the plurality of forces that are in and manifest as being. And so that's what the word actually is conjugated to mean, which is ironic because, again, it's a plural word, and this kind of starts to make some, sort of like we're thinking about monotheism. So do we believe that there is, in the category of gods, there's only one? The answer is that's not really what we're talking about. That's what monotheism seems to be talking about. There were those who were polytheists who thought there were many gods, and we think there's only one. So that's not what we're saying. We're not saying that there's a category called gods, and we only have one in that category. We're saying something very different, and that's also why the word Elokim is plural, because Hashem is not just like one in the sense of like there's only one Zev Banit. Hashem is one in a much more profound way, and the word Elokim is the way that Hashem is actually manifest as the many, as the multiplicity, as the diversity. And Hashem actually basically translates himself into the diversity that you see all around you through the tool that we call Elokim. And so that's essentially, when you look around yourself in the world. So when you see all this diversity, so there's a process through which Hashem essentially manifests that, and that's usually loosely termed as creation in English. I would call it externalization, because that's what the word bria actually means. And what Hashem is actually doing is he is externalizing himself. He's taking himself, which is a one self, and he is somehow managing to differentiate himself into this multiplicity of diversity that you see all around you. And the translation machine that diversifies Hashem in that way, that differentiates him from his oneness into the multiplicity that you see around you, that is called Elokim. And that's what the name means. That's also why that name is used repeatedly in Parshas Bereshis to describe the creation process. And so that's the translation process. Now I want to sort of just delve into that even a little further here, which is talking about Hashem as the one, as he's just like one self that then differentiates into this multiplicity. So it's not just that Hashem it's not just like he's like one guy and like he has like one body, and then it's like that sort of breaks apart into lots of smaller parts. See, the self that Hashem is, just like your own self. If you want to think about this more, you can watch my segment about the neshama being consciousness. So Hashem as a self, or as the self of all selves, is not made out of anything. So in other words, he is the source of all things and all raw material and all physical, tangible, measurable reality. But he himself, as the source of that, is intangible and is beyond measure. Just like yourself, your consciousness is also beyond measure, because your consciousness is made out of the same stuff as Hashem's self is. So what that means is that somehow, and again, there's a lot, I know I just threw a lot out there, but there's a lot to think about with that and to talk about, so that's going to be a separate segment. But for our purposes right now, so what we're really describing here is not just a differentiation from the one into the many. We're talking about a translation from the intangible self into the tangible multiplicity that you see around you. Taking something which is immeasurable, intangible, you can't see it, smell it, hear it, touch it, anything like that, and somehow it has to go through this process of translation where it gets converted into all of these tangible, diverse, measurable things that you see all around you. So those are two different, ways of describing it, but they're really both really the same thing that's happening here, is that Hashem is differentiating himself from the one into the many, and not just that, but is also translating himself from the intangible into the tangible. And the machine that does those processes that executes them is what we call Elokim. That's Hashem's set of tools that translates him from the one into the many, and from the intangible into the tangible. Now, the thing about that machine is that it's made out of multiple parts. There's a whole series of stages that Hashem kind of puts himself through, in a certain sense, in order to kind of go from the beginning product of Hashem just being the one Hashem that we like to think of as God, just Hashem, the source of reality, and it has to go through all of these stages that the machine sort of has built into it, and then ultimately it excretes, the machine kind of like exudes this final product that is whatever the diverse thing is. Like, here's a pillow over here, so it's like, Hashem has to go through all these stages, and he essentially goes through layer by layer by layer through the machine. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3, Step 4, Step 5, until eventually it's translated into the raw materials, the atomic structures, and ultimately the macro structures that look like this pillow over here. So that's the series of processes that Hashem has to go through. One of the words for that, for those who are interested or are reading the literature about these things, is the word hishtalshalut, which basically means sort of like this chain process of step by step by step that Hashem translates himself in that way. So it's a useful word just to sort of make yourself think about that process in that way. But that's really how to sort of think about it. There's really three different ways that this is described. We'll say two different ways, really, that this is described, that Hashem's translation process is described, that are essentially terminologies that are designed to take the word Elokim and break it down into sort of like the stages themselves. But I want to stress that there is no real way to break the stages into really finite individual stages, because it's really just one almost organic, seamless process, but we still have language that we use to try to sort of at least a little bit differentiate sort of where each one stage will sort of end and another stage begin, even though it's pretty seamless and doesn't really work that way. It's kind of like, you can sort of break this down into parts. You could be like, well, this is all one appendage, or you could be like, well, here's an arm and here's a hand, or you could be like, here is a palm and here's a finger, or you could be like, here's a first joint, here's a second joint, here's a third joint. You can break things down in different ways, but it's really all just one entity in a certain sense too. So the translation process with Hashem is also like that. It's all one seamless, organic process, but we have these terminologies that attempt to sort of break it down into parts so we can better grasp some like the actual process itself and understand it more deeply. But before I even explain what those parts are and how to think about them, I just want to take us back for a second to ourselves, because the first thing you need to know about what Tzelem Elokim means is that just like Hashem uses this machine we call Elokim to undergo this process of translating himself into something which is finite and tangible into the world, you are Tzelem Elokim. You are designed the same way. You, the endless self that you are, the consciousness, the neshama that you are, that is looking out through your eyes, you have a set of tools that you use to take yourself as an endless, intangible consciousness and make yourself palatable, tangible, in some way receivable, measurably receivable through a set of tools that is exactly parallel and the same as the set of tools that Hashem uses to translate himself into the being around you that you see. So if you want to think of it as an example, so you have yourself, and you have some kind of internal you-ness that you want to sort of translate into the world. You want to talk to someone that you love. You want to share yourself with them. So how are you going to do it? Well, you got to sort of go through a series of stages. You got to sort of first start to concretize what it is that you're seeing and what it is that you're experiencing, and then you want to start to put it into thoughts, and then the thoughts are going to start to put it, they're going to be concretized somewhat in there, and it'll also lead to different kinds of feelings. And then let's say you decide you want to say it out loud in words, and the combination of those underlying ways of seeing things, your perceptions and your thoughts, and then the feelings of conviction and whatever emotional association you have with the thoughts that you're having. Let's say you feel very excited and then you want to say those words. So all those steps, as ultimately it's then expressed as, well, here's the words I'm going to now say to the other person that I love, and then they're going to hear me, and they're going to understand all the different things, like, oh, he really cares about that, he feels this way, look what he thinks about this, and they suddenly experience you as you translate yourself from the intangible inner you through those things into something which is now receivable by somebody else. And when your body turns off and you don't have access to the tools that come with it, suddenly, as according to the Torah, you still exist, you're still completely, present, and yet you have just no way of being accessed or accessing others, because you have no longer have a way of translating yourself into something which is receivable by somebody else. So that's essentially the same exact thing. You are designed parallel. Hashem is this endless self that is translating himself through these different, this machine into something tangible, and so too you are also an endless self translating yourself into something which is receivable and tangible through a set of tools that directly parallels that set of tools. So we're not going to go too far in depth with this, but I just want to sort of give you some of the language for a second, which is that the set of tools. So one of the terminologies, the most famous, I would say, that what they're called is the sfirot. Now the sfirot from the word lispor, which sort of means to count, or from the word sefer, which is like a book. So if you think about what a book actually is, so a book basically takes like a series of details that there's many, it's essentially trying to capture a story, and it tells you a story. Right? Now, the thing about stories is that stories pick out particular details out of a series of events. And remember, series of events are vast. There's many different things that are taking place. Even as I'm talking now, if you wanted to summarize what's happening in this video, you could say a couple of ideas, but there's so much more, right? There's all the movement, there's the pillow example, there's like just the movement of my face and dynamics, and like there's a lot of elements that you wouldn't really want to mention in your summary of what's going on here. You would pick and choose what it is that you want to say in terms of conveying what it is that you want to talk about to somebody else about this. That's what a story is. Stories select details and then try to weave them into a coherent, cause-effect series. So then you can kind of skip over a lot of things that actually happened because they're not important to the process and series you're trying to show. Same thing is true here with the sfirot. The word sfirot essentially describes like a breakdown of the machine into 10 different stages. But remember that the reason why they're called sfirot is because they're not actually, those quantities are arbitrary. They're describing a story. It's like there's a series of steps you have to go through, and here's the 10 steps. But in fact, there's a trillion steps, and you can break it down just like with the number system. Between the numbers 0 through 9, so you have 10 digits there, and you're like, well, there's 10 digits, so that's 10 different parts. And it's like, well, it's not really true if you know how numbers work. So there's also a half and a quarter and 3 1/2 and 5 3/7, and there's all these fractions because what you wanted to break into 10 separate discrete parts is actually all just one smooth, seamless thing that you're trying to quantify in order to make it sort of make sense for your narrative. Same thing is true here. The sfirot are basically a description of the tools that Hashem uses, the Elokim tool that we're talking about here. And it's a breakdown into 10 stages, but really there's just one long stage translation process. There's one other term that's also used, which is the term olamot. So you'll find that also, usually it's translated as worlds because the word olam is translated as world. The word olam is from the word ne'elam, which means something which is hidden. The word olam kind of means a covering or a layer. And so olamot means there's a series of coverings. And what you think about what that means is that what Hashem is doing is he's essentially taking himself and he's clothing himself in covers that allow him to be more easily receivable. In other words, when if I have a very profound internal subjective experience that I am going through, and I want to share it with you, so I have to cover it in containers, and then like words and thoughts in order to sort of concretize it, so that way you can get it. But if I would just sort of, if I had a way to sort of release it into the world without putting it into coverings like that, then it would just be like this very raw explosion of just me everywhere. That's a very intense thing to encounter. That's what happens when you see somebody cry. There's almost like a much more translucent covering, where now it's like you really get a much stronger sense of their inner self. And so that's what the word olam means. It's like it's basically coverings that Hashem puts on himself when he's differentiating himself into the discrete diversity of the world. So, these are the coverings that he's using. And there's a lot of layer details there. There's 5 principal coverings that are described. And in each one of them is similar to the sfirot. You have 10 sfirot that are essentially the tools that Hashem uses, or you can call them olamot, in which case there is really 5 olamot. And so these are just different terminologies that sort of describe the same thing in different ways. Each of these terminologies and analogies has a place and a purpose, but the main point I just want to make for now is just to sort of introduce you to them and really sort of give you an idea of what the Tzelem Elokim is referring to. So that's the meta picture, meta structure here. There's an endless self translating itself into finite, receivable, or tangible, external expressions, whether that's, with Hashem, it's actually all of being is like that. And with yourself, it's your words and your thoughts and even your actions and, through your body. But that's the Tzelem Elokim process. You are a conscious self using a set of tools to translate yourself into the practical physical world. And Hashem is a conscious self that is translating himself, that using a set of tools to translate himself into all physical being that you see around you. And that's the parallelism between you and Hashem. There's obviously certain distinctions between you and Hashem, which we're not going to talk about right now. But in terms of understanding what Tzelem Elokim is, that is the meta structure, and you'll find many different sort of half expressions of this, partial descriptions of it in different places, which, everywhere you read it, you'll then be able to plug it in now to this meta framework and understand, oh, this is part of that. This is the large framework. This idea I'm hearing now is sort of like just a piece of that. So whether you hear it in a speech that you hear by a rabbi, or you're reading it in a book or wherever, you'll then be able to understand sort of where everything sort of fits once you really get this perspective clearly. Okay, so I hope that was relatively understandable and enjoyable, and looking forward to seeing you on the channel.